Hi, my name's Jennifer, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing my October wrap up. So I have organised these books into some sort of order. So I'm going to talk about my sort of spooky Halloweeny reads first, then I've got some translated fiction, then crime, psychological thrillers including some short stories, a little bit of non-fiction, and then a couple of books on the Booker Prize shortlist. I'll do them at the end because I did a separate video talking about my Booker predictions. So let's start with the spookies. First up, Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This book I wanted to read for a while and I really enjoyed it. So we follow Noemi, who has been called by her cousin to go visit her because she believes her husband is trying to poison her. So Noemi goes to stay. It's like an old isolated family home. There's various family members who are all a bit unusual. We don't know what's making Noemi's cousin unwell. There's some sort of kind of body horror type stuff in here. Descriptions are quite visceral. It is quite an OTT book and it is quite like sort of sensationalist in some ways, which I can see not being for everyone, but I really liked it. There were some elements which were kind of dreamlike, where you don't know, and the main character doesn't know what's real and what's not. There were parts of it that reminded me of The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which is one of my favourite short stories. But yeah, I really liked it. I think I can imagine this being made into a really good horror film, but I can see that it's not for everyone. Next up is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. So this is only quite a short book. I enjoyed this. This is quite a pacey story. We follow Robert Neville, who is the only survivor of a plague, which has caused all the other humans to morph into these vampire-like creatures. There's quite a lot of sort of like scientific detail, sort of musings on where he's trying to figure out what's happened and why. I haven't seen the film this is based on. Not that this is based on, the film which is based on this book. But I'd be interested to watch it actually. I believe the film has more of a Hollywood ending than the book, but I liked the ending in the book. So yeah, this is quite an enjoyable read. Okay, next up is Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. So this is a ghost story. Whenever anyone asks the question, give me a good ghost story, this always comes up. People always mention this as being really scary. I liked it, but I didn't find it particularly scary. So in this book, we follow Jack, who is on an expedition to, the Arctic, with a group of other people. What happens is one by one, the other people on the expedition drop out either before they set off or become ill on the way. So he ends up being the only one there. I did like the format. It's told in diary format, which I liked. So the creepy aspect is Jack believes he sees this like mysterious figure, and there is like a local belief that the place where he is haunted. So there were bits that were like slightly creepy, but not really. Like it was fine. Like I liked it, didn't not like it, but I think I was expecting it to be a really creepy read and it wasn't. Okay, next up is a book which I thoroughly enjoyed, Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. So this was great. I like this a lot more than I was expecting to actually. So you probably already know the story of the Body Snatchers. So we follow, the main character is a doctor called Miles who lives in this little village, and one day there's a patient brought to him who believes that her uncle is no longer her uncle. Like he looks the same, he sounds the same, but she just doesn't think it's the same person. So her friend or someone is brought to the doctor because obviously she thinks she's like gone crazy. But then what happens is there's like more people start to think the same thing. So they think that they're, relatives somehow are no longer the same person, even though they look exactly the same and they are like acting exactly the same. So at first, the doctor and other people believe that it's some form of like mass hysteria that's caught on in the village. And then one day, fairly near the start of the story, they find in the basement of someone's house this like, it's like a human-like creature. It's not alive. It's like a body of a human, but it has no like facial features. It hasn't got fingerprints. It's like a human, but before it's been imprinted as a human. And so what we find out is that, I'm going fairly early on, is that these like alien-like creatures have come to Earth and they are taking over the bodies of humans. So they come down as this sort of like lifeless form, and then they're able to then somehow, we find out how it happens, take over the bodies of humans. So I really, really like this a lot. It was a lot quieter than I was expecting. I wouldn't say it's a quiet book, but I was expecting it to be, for some reason, a bit more OTT and a bit more action-packed, and it wasn't. It had a nice, like, slow build of tension, and it had sort of a quietly menacing air about it. I really like the ending. I'm not going to say what the ending was. I really like the ending. Apparently, so there's been 4 films made of this, which I didn't realise there were so many until after I'd finished reading it. So there's been 4 films made of this. One was in the 50s, one in the 70s, and then a couple more recently. And from what I can tell, I think they all have, I don't know whether they all have different endings from each other, but they certainly, if not all, then most, have different endings to the book, which I think is quite interesting. So I am actually keen to watch. I quite like to watch the 70s version of this book, actually. But no, I really liked it. I quite like to read a bit more sort of like classic sci-fi, I think. So that was a good read. Next, okay, let's talk about Little Eyes by Samantha Schweblin. So this, I didn't mention this in my spooky TBR, but I picked up from the library and I thought it kind of fits quite nicely into this category. So this is all about these little creature machine things called Kentuckys, which are kind of like Furbies, if you remember Furbies, which were freaky. So a Kentucky is a little, like a toy, an electronic toy thing that lives in your house, and you can either be a keeper, which means that you buy the physical toy creature, so they come in like, they can be a panda or a, I don't know, other animals, and it lives in your house. Or you can be a dweller, and if you're a dweller, you are not living, but you can see through the eyes of a Kentucky. You can see into the person's house where the Kentucky is living. So whether you're a keeper or a dweller, you don't know who you're going to be matched up with. It could be someone on the other side of the world, and you can only be matched up when you buy a Kentucky can only match a keeper and a dweller once. So once that connection is ended for whatever reason, that's it. So it's an interesting idea. So you know that saying, this meeting could have been an email. This book for me could have been a short story, I think. So the way it's told by, there's lots of different narratives and they don't really interlink other than the fact that they all involve Kentuckys. So we jump between different narratives and then back to one that we've already seen throughout the whole book. And like some of the stories I like more than others. Like there's one where a Kentucky falls in love with another Kentucky. That was I think my favourite story from the book. But for me, either it could have been just a short story, or I think I would have preferred it if it was just like each story in its completion and then the next one, rather than moving back and forth, because that just didn't quite work for me. So I mean, it was okay, but I think maybe just not quite for me. And then I wanted to mention the book that I DNF'd, and I'm only mentioning this because it was on my spooky TBR. So it's The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, and I I read a good 200 pages, actually probably more than that. I mean, maybe even 250 pages. I read a lot, but I just gave up in the end because I just lost the plot, couldn't follow what was going on. So it took me a bit to get into it to start with. And then once I had an idea of what was going on, I actually quite liked it. So the backstory is there's a group of 4 friends who they go hunting and one of them shoots this elk. This is like, I don't know, 20 years in the past or something. And then we jump forward to the future and this elk somehow is reappearing in their lives. Anyway, I actually quite liked the crux of the story, the horror bit, and it is weird. There's a lot of there's weird bodily stuff, kind of gross stuff, and some fantastical elements as well. And I actually quite liked that. But then, as we went on, I just lost track of who was who and what was going on, to the point that I literally didn't know what was happening. So I ended up DNFing it, sadly. Okay, so next let's move on to some translated fiction. So first up is Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Tsujimura. And this is translated from Japanese by Philip Gabriel. So this was a 5-star read. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. This is so good. So we follow Kokoro is the main character. She's a young girl who is she's not going to school because she doesn't like it. She's getting bullied. There's stuff going on there. She can't really talk to her parents about it. And so she's saying that she's not well or she's got stomachache and things like that. She's at home in her bedroom during the day. And then what happens one day is her mirror in her bedroom starts shining. And she goes into the mirror and she ends up in this castle. And in this castle there are, I think, 6 other children who have come from wherever else. And the same thing has happened to them. So the mirror in their bedroom has started shining and they've gone through it and ended up in this castle. Okay. So when they're in the castle, they meet the Wolf Queen, who is a young girl who wears this wolf mask. And the Wolf Queen tells them about the rules of the castle. So they are in the castle. They need to find a key which will grant them a wish. So whoever finds the key, they'll be granted a wish. But there are some consequences to that. And okay, I recognise that what I'm saying sounds like crazy, but it's actually quite a quiet book for the most part, because what we see is Kokoro and the other children trying to figure out why they have been brought to this castle, finding out more about the other children, more about themselves, thinking about what connects them. And then as we get further into the book, the stakes become higher and it does have more of the propulsion of a thriller, I would say, as we get towards the end. But it's just, I absolutely loved it. It's such a lovely book. It's thoughtful. I guess it's about belonging and fitting in and finding your place and friendship. And honestly, it's just such a lovely book. And it did my favourite thing, which is that it surprised me. I wasn't sure what to expect going into it. And honestly, by the end of the book, I was just wowed. Honestly, if you can get your hands on this, pick up from your library or whatever, it's honestly so good. Okay, next is some more Japanese fiction. This is The Cat Who Saved Books by Suzuki Natsukawa, and this is translated from Japanese by Louise Heel Kawai. So, this was disappointing. I really did not like this book at all. And, you know, cats and books, I mean, what's not to love, but clearly quite a lot. So, where do I start? So, we follow, what's his name? Rintaro. So, Rintaro is a school-age boy who dies? His grandfather. His grandfather owns a bookshop who dies, and then Rintaro, even though he's kind of a child, ends up sort of looking after it. And he meets this cat who talks. The cat is actually quite annoying. And he is set these 4 challenges that he has to complete, and they're called labyrinths in the book. I don't really know why they're called labyrinths, because unless my understanding of what a labyrinth is completely wrong, they're not labyrinths. So on these challenges, on each challenge, he's taken to this place. So it has, I guess, kind of some fantastical elements to it. And there'll be someone who doesn't treat books well for whatever reason, and there's a few different ways that people don't treat books well. So for example, there's someone who just like reads and reads thousands and thousands of books, but just reads like synopsises of the books, but doesn't read the books themselves. There's someone who like just owns loads of books but doesn't read them, or I don't know, different things like that. And honestly, the overall tone of the book was quite preachy, quite smug. There's a female character in the book who is friends with Rintaro, and she is spoken to and treated in a fairly patronising way, which I didn't appreciate. And it was just all quite trite and cliche, like to a certain extent. Okay, this book is going to be, I imagined it was going to be kind of a cosy read, I guess, but honestly this just left me feeling cold, which I don't think was the point of the book. It just felt like it had no heart, and I disliked it quite a lot. And then the final translated work on this list, I think, is Untold Night and Day by Suah. This is translated from Korean by Deborah Smith. So this is only a short little book. This was a weird read. Okay, so we follow, what's her name? Ayami. So Ayami works in a theatre for blind people in Seoul, and we learn right at the start of the book that the theatre is closed down for good. So we see Ayami pondering on what she's going to do with her life, how she's going to earn a living. She says she doesn't have any qualifications. She doesn't think she's got any other sort of transferable skills or experience, and there's no other similar theatres in Seoul where she could go and work. So she goes for dinner with the director. And basically that's all I can tell you about the plot, because it's very, very strange. It's meant to be a strange book, clearly, but it is kind of fever dream-ish. And so other characters pop up, but then people sort of morph into each other, and relationships between characters become unclear and morph, and it's very strange. I think I liked it, but I felt like, and I actually think this is probably a genius book, but my understanding of it was just like there. It was like just out of reach, like I couldn't quite get what was going on, but I still think I like the journey. And one of the things that this book does is it repeats, it doesn't do it a lot, but it repeats the same paragraph or couple of lines like a few pages further on. And so you're like, didn't I just read that? And then you look back and you did. Or it'll repeat it, but it won't be exactly the same. Some of the words will be changed. It has some repeated motifs throughout. And it has some sort of like dreamlike sequences as well. So for a short book, there's a lot going on. And yeah, it's good, but it's very, very strange. Okay, next up I'll talk about some crime fiction that I've read. So first up is The Herons Cry by Anne Cleeves. So this is the second in Anne Cleeves' latest series of books, which follow Detective Matthew Venn, set in Devon. So I think I like the first book in the series more than this one. This book we follow, there's been a murder of, the person who's murdered is someone who works in, what's the word, kind of like patient advocacy sort of thing, speaking up for patients' rights. There's a lot in this book about suicide right throughout the whole book, which I think there was an attempt to do it in a good way, in a sensitive way, which for the most part worked, but at some occasions I felt like it didn't quite fall right for me. I can't actually remember much about the plot, I'm not going to lie, I read this at the start of the month. It was alright, decent read, but you know, nothing special. Okay, next up we have In the Dark by Cara Hunter. This is the first book by Cara Hunter that I've read, and I quite liked it actually. This is good. So this is police procedural. The premise of this, which is what led to me picking it up because I was intrigued, is that a woman and a child are found locked in a basement room, barely alive. No one knows who they are. They don't know, the woman when she's released isn't able to speak. We don't know why they're there, what's led to them being there. There's the person who owns the house, lives in the house where they are found, claims to have claims to not be aware that they were there in the basement. So it's quite an intriguing premise. This was a real page turner, not least because there's no chapters. There is like breaks in the book, you know, with the little stars that they do, like that. But there's no chapters, which did lead to it being a real page turner. There's a kind of an odd narrative voice in that some bits are told in the first person by whoever the main detective inspector is. So like just like bits are in the first person, then lots of other sections are told third person, with the view of, because there's quite a few police officers going on in the book, and then we have some other like transcripts of things and different sort of like documentation, which I quite like, because I quite like that in a crime novel actually, I must say. So yeah, this was good. It was kind of OTT, I'm not going to lie, kind of dramatic and kind of ridiculous, but I still really enjoyed it. Sometimes that's just what you need, and I would definitely read more by this author. So yeah, good one. Let's talk about Magpie by Elizabeth Day next. Okay, so let me just think what I can tell you about this book. So, what I can tell you about this book is we follow Marissa and Jake, who have just taken in a lodger called Kate. So, Marissa is suspicious of Kate. She's acting strangely. Marissa is suspicious of the relationship between Kate and Jake. And Marissa just doesn't know. She knows something's not quite right, but she doesn't know what. So that's what I can tell you. This was a real page turner, very, very pacey. And so what I didn't like about this book was the way that mental illness was portrayed. And not just portrayed, but how can I say this? How the character who is suffering mental illness is treated by other people. And I don't think as the reader we're meant to necessarily see how the character is being treated as terrible as what it actually is, if that makes sense. And what kind of annoyed me is the quotes on the back by other authors, which... So, okay, I'm going to read you one quote, so this quote does mention two themes which are covered in the book, but it's on the back cover. So, okay, so I'm going to tell you what it says. It says, an absorbing exploration of infertility and mental illness, combined with the pace and plot of a hot-racing thriller. Okay, so that's Sarah Collins. And so infertility and mental illness. So infertility in this book, I think, is well represented, discussed. I understand Elizabeth Day has personal experience of infertility, and I think it presents a viewpoint that and discussion that I haven't seen before in fiction. Okay, so I do think that's done well, but in my view at the expense of what it says about mental illness. And then the other quotes by other authors, you know, Magpie is a book that needed to exist in the world. It is the book that was missing. That's Lisa Taddeo. The book that was missing. There's a quote from Kate Moss. Magnificent, clever, beautifully crafted, gripping, warm. There's a quote by Jessie Burton. Superbly taught and well written, noirish, with a big and beating heart. So the way it's being described as warm, with a big and beating heart, the book that the world was missing. Kind of like, I don't know, is it just me? I really just don't think the way mental health is dealt with in this book is warm or with a big heart. And I don't know how you can just ignore that really. So I probably am not going to be picking up anything else by Elizabeth Day. One. Okay, next up I read a short story collection called Murder by the Book, edited by Martin Edwards. So this is a collection of Golden Age crime short stories written by a variety of crime writers, and they all have the theme of books or writing in some way in them. Overall it was an enjoyable read. Obviously some I liked more than others. My favourite story was called Dear Editor by Christiana Brand, which was really clever, which is told, so it's introduced by Christiana Brand sending a note to her editor to say, oh, you asked me to contribute a short story for an anthology, but your request got missing in the mail and it went to someone else rather than me, but they've written this story, so here it is, and it's really very, very good. Okay, next let's talk about a little bit of non-fiction. Unusual for me, this is kind of a celebrity memoir. This is Watching Neighbours Twice a Day by Josh Widdicombe. If you're not in the UK, you probably have no idea who Josh Widdicombe is, I imagine. He is a British comedian. I think he's quite funny. But what led me to pick this up is because this is all about growing up in the 90s in Britain, sort of through the lens of 90s TV and 90s pop culture. And this was so good. This was a really like nostalgic read. I think Josh is like a year younger than me, so you know, most of the references I got TV shows that I used to watch growing up. There's references to sport and other things as well in there, but honestly this was so funny. I laughed out loud so many times reading this book. I feel like it's probably kind of a niche book, unless you like grew up in Britain in the 90s, like watching TV, probably not going to make any sense to you. But if you did, then seriously, it's a great read. Okay, so let's finish by talking about two shortlisted books that I read in the last month. The first one I'll talk about is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. So this is a whopper of a book. It's like 600 pages long. So we follow, what's her name? You'd think I'd remember her name. Marion. We follow Marion through her whole life. So right from before she's born up to the end of her life. And she dreams of being a pilot, and she does become a pilot. This is really quite a sprawling story following, obviously mainly following Marion, but other characters in her life. And then we have a dual narrative. So the other narrative is from Hadley, who is an actor in Hollywood who is going to be playing Marion in a film about Marion's life. And so the parts from Hadley are shorter. Marion is like the main focus of the novel. There are some parallels drawn between Marion's life and between Hadley's life. we know from the blurb that Marion sets off to fly around the globe and is crash landed on Antarctica, trying to survive. So we know that that's going to happen, and I was disappointed that that didn't come till like right at the end of the book, like after page 500, you know, before we even got to Antarctica. I wanted it to be more of a survivalist story than it was. I think for me, this didn't really work for me, and that's probably just because of my preferences. Like, I don't really like, it's not so much the length of the book, but the sprawling nature of it. I prefer novels with a much tighter focus. I think this obviously told the whole of Marion's life story, and I can see why people like it, and I admire its ambition. But I think it just wasn't for me. From how I've heard other people speak about this book, I kind of have a feeling this might win the Booker. By the time you watch this, we'll know who's won. Exciting. I don't know, I've got a feeling this might win. I don't want it to win. I mean, no offence, but it's just not for me. But the book that I do want to win, and that I absolutely adored, is A Passage North by Anuk Arudpragasam. So this book's amazing. I only just read this last week because my library didn't have a copy, so I kindly asked them if they would consider purchasing a copy, because it has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and they did. And honestly, I adored this book so much. So this, for me, is kind of the opposite of Great Circle. So this has a really tight focus. It's very introspective, very reflective. We follow the main character called Christian, who finds out that his grandmother's former carer has passed away, and we follow him on his journey north, set in Sri Lanka, to go to the funeral of his mother's carer. And that's basically the plot. But what we have is Christian reflecting on some elements of his life. So, for example, there was a relationship that didn't work out. He reflects on that. We have reflections on war. They are always at a step removed. So we see how his grandmother's carer was sort of tragically affected by the war in different ways, and so we have Christian reflecting on that. We have him thinking about, for example, a documentary he's watched that had something to do with the war. But the writing in this book is absolutely exquisite, sublime, best writing I think I've ever read in a book. Honestly, I adored it. It was like being swept away by gentle waves reading this book. I loved it so much. I absolutely couldn't put it down, didn't want it to end. I just loved it. So for me, this is what I would personally like to win the book prize. It's probably not going to, because the one I want to win never wins. But I have already picked up, a copy of his first novel, which is The Story of a Brief Marriage. I picked that one up already, so I'm looking forward to probably getting to this one in the next month or so, because I'm really keen to read more from that author, because I think he's an absolute genius. So that's everything. I feel like that was a long video, so I'm really sorry if you made it to the end. Like, seriously, well done, and thank you, because I'm tired now. I don't know about you, but thank you so much for watching. I hope you're all well, and I'll speak to you all again very soon. Bye.